DNA suggests Mesopotamians came from India and Tibet.
And we found that he has broadly Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. About 80% of his ancestry is best matched to that of other individuals in North Africa that we.
What if the biggest mistake in ancient history is not what we forgot, but what we sorted into the wrong boxes? For generations, people have been taught to imagine the ancient world as a map of clean edges, Mesopotamia here, Africa there, civilizations rising like isolated islands from separate soil, separate blood, separate destinies, neat, comfortable, easy to print in textbooks. But real human history has never behaved like a row of labeled jars on a museum shelf. It spills, it mixes, it stains the fingers of anyone who tries to hold it still. And that is exactly why one laboratory result, pulled from the cracked silence of a Sumerian burial, detonated like a whisper in a cathedral, the room cold enough to make breath look guilty. Stainless steel, filtered air, white light so sharp it seemed to erase shadows instead of casting them. On the central table sat a fragment of bone no larger than a child's thumb joint, lifted from a burial near the alluvial cradle of southern Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians once built cities out of mud and mathematics. The fragment did not look important. It looked ordinary, dry, fragile, almost offended to be touched. But ordinary things are often the most dangerous. A scrap of paper can start a war. A single cell can overturn a family secret. A sliver of ancient bone can make half the internet forget how to breathe. The team running the test had every reason to be cautious. Ancient DNA is moody, it breaks apart, it absorbs contamination from archaeologists, storage rooms, handling mistakes, and time itself. Every result has to be fought for. Every pattern has to survive the suspicion of error. So when the first readouts began to appear, nobody in the lab celebrated. They frowned, they checked protocols, they reran controls, they cleaned surfaces again. They opened the data as if it might bite, because the pattern was wrong. Or maybe more honestly, it was wrong according to expectation. The broad assumption was simple. If a viable genetic profile emerged from a Sumerian-associated individual, then the strongest comparisons should cluster neatly with nearby ancient populations from Southwest Asia. That was the safe expectation, the kind that lets everyone go home on time, a line of continuity, a regional story, a predictable paper title. Instead, one cluster in the analysis kept pulling the sample south and west toward African populations tied to ancient corridors many casual history fans rarely place at the center of the civilization story. At first, it looked like noise, statistical static, a machine hiccup, then the pattern returned in a second comparison, and a third. The data did not shout, it persisted, which is more frightening. Now imagine being the person staring at that screen, not a movie scientist, not a mad professor, just a specialist who has spent years learning how to distrust excitement. You are looking at columns of letters and probabilities, but your pulse behaves as if you're holding a lit match in a dry forest. Because if this result survives, it does not simply add a footnote to ancient Mesopotamia, it challenges the way people think migration should look. It threatens every lazy diagram where arrows move in one direction and identity stays pure. You know what happens next? People will rush in. Some will try to turn the result into a tribal trophy. Others will try to bury it under jargon. Some will insist it proves everything. Others will insist it proves nothing. Very few will ask the hard question. What exactly does a match mean? That question sounds technical. It is not. It is a trapdoor. Because DNA is not a flag. It is not a passport stamped once and forever. It is more like a river system after 1,000 storms. Streams split, merge, vanish underground, reappear in new valleys, carry silt from places they no longer touch. When scientists compare ancient animals to living populations, they are not asking, who owns this ancestor? They are asking, where do echoes still remain? And echoes can survive in surprising rooms. The team widened the analysis. They brought in comparative data sets from across the Near East, the Nile Corridor, the Horn of Africa, and populations shaped by ancient movement along Red Sea and Saharan routes that were greener and more alive in deep prehistory than many people realize. Back when deserts were not yet the walls they later became, the world between Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia was less a border than a breathing seam. That was the first crack in the familiar story. The second crack was stranger. Linguists had long argued over the Sumerians because Sumerian as a language sits in history like a stone dropped from a height. It is not comfortably folded into the major language families around it. It feels self-contained, stubborn, almost orphaned. Archaeologists, meanwhile, have argued over whether Sumerian civilization emerged primarily from local development, migration, cultural blending, or some combination too messy for a simple headline. The old temptation has always been to search for a single source, a cradle beneath the cradle, one origin dramatic enough to satisfy the human appetite for clean beginnings. But clean beginnings are a myth adults tell themselves because mud makes them nervous. As the days passed, the sample refused to behave like a clean beginning. It suggested not a lone line of descent, but a braided ancestry, with signals linking the individual to populations shaped by ancient interactions stretching across ecologies now treated as separate worlds. Marsh and river, Gulf and coast, Nile and Red Sea, savanna memory and city-state ambition. The result was not saying the Sumerians were secretly this one modern group. That would have been simple. It was saying something far more unsettling. The categories came later. You can feel the twist now, can't you? The surprise was not that one ancient civilization could be connected to Africa. The real surprise was that our shock says more about us than about them. We inherited a map with hard lines and projected it backward. They lived in a world of moving shorelines, migrating herders, merchant sailors, hugging dangerous coasts, fisher communities following seasonal wealth, families merging through necessity, diplomacy, desire, hunger, and chance. We ask history to stand still for our convenience. It never did. Still, even that was not the deepest turn in the story, because the more carefully the team modeled the data, the less the result looked like a simple one-way migration from Africa into Sumer or from Mesopotamia into Africa. Instead, the strongest interpretation pointed towards something older, a shared ancestral layer preserved differently on both sides of later historical divides, not a parent-child relationship. More like cousins who inherited different pieces of the same shattered mirror. That changed everything. Suddenly, the question was no longer, did one population come from the other? It became, what vanished human landscape fed both? A landscape from an age when climate, coastlines, and mobility created pathways that later generations forgot. A landscape where the Sahara was not always the giant locked door we imagine, where maritime crossings were not science fiction, where survival itself rewarded movement and mixture. If that interpretation holds, then the so-called surprise match is not evidence of an anomaly at the edge of civilization. It is evidence that civilization itself may have emerged from networks far wider than the old stories allow. And now the room feels different. No longer just a lab. Now it is a courtroom, a confession booth, a tomb cracked open not by treasure hunters, but by sequenced data and disciplined doubt. The principal investigator, according to the internal notes circulating between collaborators, pushed back hard against early hype. Good hype is the tax bad thinking imposes on discovery. The sample size was limited. One individual cannot stand in for an entire civilization. Preservation biases distort what survives. Burial identity is complicated. Archaeological labels do not map cleanly onto ancestry. All true, all essential. The last thing serious science needs is a viral slogan stapled onto a nuanced result, but caution did not erase the tension, it sharpened it. Because even if the sample could not answer everything, it had already asked a better question than most people were prepared to hear. What if ancient Sumer was never a sealed cultural experiment, but the visible crest of a much older wave of human mixing that linked river plains, coastlines, and African corridors long before history began writing itself in stone? You sitting there right now might feel a tug of resistance. That is normal. We all do it. The brain loves a tidy shelf. It hates realizing the labels have fallen off. So picture the ancient world again, not as continents staring at each other across impossible distance, but as a network of lanterns in the dark. Some near, some far. Their light overlaps on water, on trade routes, on marriages, on shared technologies, on remembered routes carried in song long before anyone made them official. Grain moves, copper moves, beads move, boats move, myths move. People move most of all. By the time the first city rises high enough to cast a historical shadow, it may already be the child of 10 unseen journeys. That possibility gives the Sumerian sample its electricity. Then came the argument that nearly tore the interpretation in half. One camp insisted the African affinity might reflect later contamination in the comparative datasets, or broad, deep ancestry too old to make any specific historical claim. Another argued that dismissing the pattern simply because it challenged expectation was its own form of bias. The debate grew teeth, emails lengthened. Words like robustness, admixture, temporal resolution, and population structure began doing the work of knives under velvet. Science can look calm from a distance. Up close, it often sounds like controlled panic with footnotes. At this stage, an outsider might want a clean winner. That is not how discovery works. The truth usually arrives wearing muddy boots. It enters by contradiction. It refuses to flatter anyone. And in this case, every additional layer of analysis made one thing harder to deny: the old civilizational story, the one separating Mesopotamia and Africa into clean ancestral theaters, was at best incomplete and, at worst, deeply misleading. Then the third turn arrived. A second sample from the same broader archaeological horizon, poorer in preservation but not useless, hinted at a different ancestry profile altogether, not opposite, just different enough to matter. Suddenly, the first result was no longer a singular bombshell. It was part of a mosaic. One individual leaned more strongly toward one ancestral blend, another toward a different combination. The city behind them, whatever its exact name or polity, began to look less like a monolith and more like a harbor made of human biographies. That is the image that lingers. Not a civilization as a pure bloodline, but as a crowded port at dawn. Reed boats creaking, silt under sandals, fish scales catching first light, temple walls still cool from the night, accountants pressing signs into clay, traders bringing stories from coasts you have never seen, children with grandmothers from different horizons, languages brushing against each other like fabrics in a market, the smell of bitumen, wet earth, sweat, salt, beer, and river reeds. A city is not a fossil. It is an argument made out of strangers learning how to live close. And maybe that is what the DNA was trying to say all along. Not that one modern identity can lay claim to Sumer like a deed. Not that history has a secret champion waiting to be crowned, but that civilization at its beginning may have been more African, more Asian, more entangled, more ocean-facing, more migratory, and more gloriously impure than the simplified diagrams ever admitted. That idea unsettles people for a reason. Purity stories are emotionally efficient. Entanglement stories demand maturity. Yet the evidence, when it comes, rarely asks our permission. The team drafted language carefully. Too carefully for some observers, not carefully enough for others. They emphasize uncertainty, sample limits, comparative frameworks, and the difference between affinity and identity. Still, once whispers of the result escaped, the public imagination did what it always does. It sprinted ahead of the data. Headlines wanted certainty. Comment sections wanted combat. The sample itself, silent for millennia, had become the center of a modern storm about belonging, origins, and who gets to stand nearest the first cities. And here is the hardest part. The bone fragment did not care. It did not care about modern nationalism, online tribalism, or the fantasy that ancestry can be reduced to a slogan. It carried chemistry, damage patterns, sequence fragments, nothing more. The fire came from us, our hunger, our fear that if the roots of civilization spread across more than one cherished boundary, then identity becomes less like a fortress and more like weather. Maybe it always was. By the end of the internal review, no grand final verdict had been carved in stone. There was no cinematic moment where everyone stood stunned and rewrote the textbooks before lunch. Real discovery is crueler than that. It gives you enough clarity to destroy the old certainty, then leaves the new picture unfinished. So where did that leave the so-called surprise match? Here, in a strange, thrilling middle ground, strong enough to challenge inherited assumptions, complex enough to resist propaganda, suggestive of deep links between ancient Mesopotamia and African population histories, whether through shared ancestral layers, migration corridors, coastal exchange, or combinations still hidden by time. Powerful, not because it closed the case, but because it reopened it at a much deeper level. And maybe that is the true shock. Not that the test pointed toward Africa, but that civilization's earliest chapters may never have belonged inside the borders later generations drew around them. The surprise is not in the match. The surprise is in the mirror it holds up to our own habits of thought. So the next time someone tells you ancient history is settled, that the first cities emerged from neatly separated worlds, remember the cold lab, the stubborn data, the river of ancestry refusing to stay inside its banks. Remember that history is often less like a monument and more like a delta, splitting and rejoining until no single channel can claim the sea. And if one tiny fragment of Sumerian bone could do this much damage to certainty, what happens when the next tomb is opened, the next genome is cleaned, the next forgotten corridor lights up on the map? That question is already waiting. If you want the next deep dive into ancient mysteries that rewrite everything you thought you knew, subscribe, follow, and stay close, because the next trail leads from the first cities to a coastline even older than memory, and it may change the story again.